History is full of amazing stories and memorable people.
But we don't care about them.
No hits, deep tracks only.
Some of the most influential people in the world have been completely overlooked or just plain forgotten.
We're digging deep into the history books to bring you their stories.
I'm Phil.
And I'm Matt.
We're not historians. We're just two guys who enjoy a great story and plenty of laughs.
This is History's B-Side. Today's B-Sider is The Witch of Wall Street.
When we set out on this historic podcast adventure, I think we both expected to become very wealthy from our podcast expertise.
I didn't expect to become wealthy. Together. I thought you were going to say wealthy with knowledge, Phil.
Yes, there are many kinds of wealth. And of course, I think we have become wealthy with knowledge, but, you know, we making that cha-ching too, them big bucks.
Yep, you know it. I just, the only thing keeping me going at this point is that day of the month where I get to cash my History's B-Side check. My day just becomes better.
So if you can't read through the sarcasm, you are welcome to support the show on historiesbside.com or through our merchandise website. But seriously, figured we would, start out today's episode talking about money, because it's an interesting topic. I think money is something that everyone can relate to in that it's useful. It's something that you need. So how are you with money? Are you good at saving money? Are you infinitely wealthy that you don't even have to care about it? How much is in your bank account right now?
Right now, I don't want to answer that question.
And if you could include the numbers to it and like your PIN, I would appreciate that.
I mean, it's not going to get you far. It's less than $200. I guarantee you that at the moment. But that'll go up.
So what
on Friday?
So what is your saving money management strategy?
It's not good. I'm largely impulsive. I understand how to manage money, and when I have the discipline to, I do it quite well, but the discipline part is where I run into problems because I'm a very, like I said, impulsive buyer, and I also kind of have this existential mentality of like, do it, live it up today, because you don't know how long you'll get. And so that leads me to justify a lot of expenditure that I probably could cut back on, especially when it comes to like dining out or eating out. I don't know what the difference between those two are.
Well,
takeout, whatever. I mean, I would like to be better at it. Let's just say that. I think there's some areas where I'm probably further ahead than the average person. One of those is probably not the balance in my savings account, but I have a fair amount in the stock market, and I feel like that's not super common. At least if you take like an average example of an American, I don't believe that many people are heavily invested or even try to invest in the stock market. And weirdly enough, economics is kind of like a weird, nerdy hobby of mine. And you'd think that would lead to better money management strategy. But like I said, it's about discipline, not about understanding.
Well, I was going to make a crack at you for, being a millennial, and that's what makes you impulsive and wanting to enjoy life now versus saving it, because, we've lived through some pretty dramatic things in our short 20 to 30 years.
We've lived through enough that I no longer feel like I'm wrong in defending that position. I'm like, I struggle to find evidence otherwise.
I mean, we're a little bit different in that respect because I would say I'm good at saving money. I'm not good at necessarily managing it in the best way. Like I probably should be doing more as far as putting it into certain accounts that are going to compound interest and set me up for retirement and things like that. But I am pretty good at saving money just because I pretend that I don't have it and then I don't spend it. And I don't necessarily like to treat myself to things that seem frivolous a lot, other than,
Right.
going out to eat. Like you said, like that's probably my biggest vice, I guess. But we can skip on our, I guess, personal finances. But you brought up the stock market, which is what I really was curious about, because I know we've talked about this before, that you have invested some money in the stock market, and I haven't really, at least not to the level that you have, but I've at least toyed around with apps like Robinhood and some other kind of stock investment apps. So can you talk about that at all? Like, what's your experience or strategy with stocks?
I mean, I'm pretty fresh to the stock world. I've only been actually paying attention to what I own for like 2 years, but I've had an account for longer than that. I think a lot of people jump into it with like a day trader strategy, or like I guess that's the only way to say it, is like buy low, sell high. You're trying to like strategically choose which stocks are going to do that for you. And, that's what some people do. They're called day traders. They try to like anticipate the movement of certain companies and make money off of that. And I've read a couple like beginner investment books, and them combined with Warren Buffett on a podcast all say that of those people that try to day trade every year, only about a third of them beat the S&P 500, which is like a conglomeration of the largest 500 companies.
Right.
And so kind of like a snapshot of the overall economy. And so if only a third of professional day traders beat that, I don't really believe on any level that I'm going to be able to research my way into doing well with that strategy. And so what those people that I named, especially Warren Buffett, recommend, and the few books that I've read recommend, is that you do exactly that and invest in the S&P 500 or something like it, like an index fund that basically holds a lot of different companies instead of trying to bet on singular companies, unless you're merely doing it for fun. So most of what I have is in the Vanguard S&P 500 because its average return annually over time is 8%, and that's better than a savings account and will eventually compound if you keep adding to it to a comfortable amount of money over 40 years. But it's not a way to get rich quick unless you have an enormous amount of money already.
So you clearly have put more thought into this than I do, which is probably why you have more invested in it than I have. Because I literally downloaded it just kind of because I felt like it was something that I should be more knowledgeable in. And I just kind of wanted to find some stocks that were fairly inexpensive that I wouldn't care about buying and selling quickly,
right,
and knew that it wouldn't be a huge risk to lose very much money on it. And really just as a way to educate myself on kind of how the stock market works. And it's probably not the best way to do it, but I don't expect to make a ton of money doing it anyway. It was kind of just playing around with those whatever easy apps to use.
Right.
But like I said, I just kind of have only really a small amount of money actually on them, and I try to kind of watch the stocks that I have. It's been pretty depressing lately to see how quickly a lot of them are falling.
Yeah,
but I don't
terrible.
think that's a conversation we necessarily need to spend the next hour talking about. Did you watch the Super Bowl at all? Did you see all those ads for like crypto, all the different coins and all that stuff?
I didn't watch a lot of it. I will say that's maybe the kicker there, is that I only watched the halftime show and then the second half of the game, and I saw a ton of them.
Have you bought into any of that?
Yeah, I have a Robinhood account, and I own some Ethereum, which is a cryptocurrency. And then
that's like the trendy one, isn't it? Like Bitcoin's the main one, but Ethereum's like supposed to be doing really well or something.
Bitcoin was the first one. And then it's hard to explain the difference between them without getting into some real deep computer programming cryptocurrency talk that I don't even fully understand. But
this is probably the point where we should jump in and say that nothing we are talking about on this episode is financial advice. Do not listen to us. We're a couple of dummies just talking about our own experiences.
But as far as I can understand it, in like the dumbest layman's terms, Bitcoin as a cryptocurrency, its like blockchain structure is just transactions. So it records every time it's traded. So if I give you a Bitcoin, it records that. If you give it to Jess, it records that. If she gives it back to me, it records that. So the entire Bitcoin has attached to it this code that's basically an encrypted recording of what it's gone through for its entire lifetime. And that's why they're theoretically more secure than money. Ethereum allows for contracts, which again, as like vague and as dumb as I can say this, instead of just being a transaction, I can like have you agree to give me this many if I do a certain task. And that mere bit of logical flexibility means you can build other cryptocurrencies off of Ethereum and use Ethereum for different things instead of just as a store of basic transactional value. So that's I think why Ethereum's trendier, because you can, instead of it just being like, you know, imagine if you had Legos and all you thought you could do with the Legos were trade them back and forth for one other Lego. Now you, like with Ethereum, you've realized you can use the Legos to build stuff. That's kind of how I see it in my 5-year-old mind.
I feel like you've lost me. I'm just sitting here listening to you, knowing that we were going to talk about this today.
I'm going to be honest with you and anybody that is listening to this. I've been trying to understand Bitcoin and Ethereum and cryptocurrency and blockchain for 6 months. Truly, I've listened to every podcast I can find. I've read books. I've read articles. I still am. I feel like my brain's just not recognizing the complexity of the problem.
So I bought some Dogecoin because one day I saw it was like trending on Twitter and it was like, I don't know, 10 o'clock at night. And I was like, whatever. And I looked at it and it was, the value at the time was like less than a penny or something like that. So I spent like $2.50 on it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how many Dogecoin I own because I don't even know if I'm saying it right. But it's now worth like 13 cents, which is nothing in theory. But considering I bought it for less than a penny and now that it's worth 13 cents is like kind of actually cool. So like that $2.50 I bought peaked at like being worth like $60. And now it's not worth that. It's worth like, I don't know, whatever the math on
so
that is.
I bought Dogecoin in November. Not a lot, but I bought it at 0.025. So 20% of 1 cent. Maybe. I don't know.
That would be 2.5 cents.
2.5 cents. Okay, I bought it for 2.5 cents. And I bought like probably $100 worth of it at that price and then moved it to Ethereum. And now I feel stupid because if you're telling me it's at 13 cents.
No. So you bought into it late because I bought it before it got like super trendy and then it jumped up to, I think it peaked at like 25 or 30 cents and then it dropped back down into the teens and it's been steady in like the between 12 to 15 cents.
Yeah.
When I say steady, like that's steady for cryptocurrency, I feel like, but it's not worth anything really.
Right.
But considering I spent $2.50 on it, I feel like I'm pretty proud that however much I bought is still worth like $20.
Right. Well, and that's the thing.
So
like,
it's like not even worth selling because maybe it will turn into the next Bitcoin, but probably not because it's really just like an internet meme that people thought was funny.
Right. I think the attraction of those types of coins, because like Bitcoin and Ethereum have functional value, but the thing with Dogecoin and these other meme coins is that they're really volatile. Like you have to buy them right before somebody famous does something with them and then sell right after that happens. Like,
Stupid Elon Musk.
Right. Elon Musk tweeted about it and then it rose like several 100%. And if you had the fortitude to like invest millions of dollars in it right before that and then sold it, you could have possibly made, tens of millions of dollars. But it's not like, how would you know that? The same thing with Snoop Dogg bought it or tweeted that he bought it or something like that. He tweeted a picture of the Shiba Inu like before, like right before or right after the Super Bowl, and it jumped again because of that, because of something that dumb. So it's like, that's where I have a hard time trusting it, as like, there's no strategy to be had there unless you know something that other people don't.
Yeah. And before we get too, I don't know, in the weeds about stuff that we are certainly not experts in, I guess I want to caution anyone that's listening to this to say that your dad gave me some great advice when we were talking about investing. And that was just that if you don't really know what you're investing in, don't bother.
Yeah.
Because you're not going to make a ton of money on something out of sheer luck. Like, you need to know what you're really doing to try to make some actual money on it. So when I say like I bought some of it, I literally spent $2.50 on it because I can afford to lose $2.50.
Yeah.
So that's the only real advice I think I'll give people is don't, throw your money away on something you don't understand.
Yeah. That's why I said the day trader thing. It's like, these people spend 80 hours a week doing this for a living, and only 30% of them beat the basic index fund. Mm-hmm. So it's unlikely that any Joe Schmo who's just like, I don't know, on Wall Street bets and listening to a couple podcasts is gonna outdo that on a regular basis enough to make it worth all the time.
Well, this intro has already gone way longer than I expected it to. So I guess we'll start to work into our main topic today. And we're actually going to be talking about someone who's from the time period in the United States known as the Gilded Age of America. And that's a time period that I am familiar with as far as hearing about it, but not knowing, I guess, a ton about what that really means. And I don't want to go too in-depth into it because I think today's B-Sider, in her own right, is pretty interesting and has a lot to her story. So just to give a little bit of background on the time period that she came to prominence in, the Gilded Age of America took place basically from 1870 to 1900, and it was characterized by flashy materialism and abject poverty. So really, political corruption and inequality were at their peaks. The economy was being driven by booming growth of industrialization and increased labor force, as immigration and the end of the Reconstruction era flooded the lower classes and created massive wealth disparities. So naturally, the industrialists and financiers rose to the top and created the nation's first super wealthy class. And as we've kind of mentioned, like Elon Musk and some other people like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, I guess I want to get your thoughts on this. Like, what do you think are some of the common characteristics of the super wealthy?
As far as their like money tactics, or just in general?
Anything. I mean, like, I guess I'll start. I think people that are super wealthy tend to have a lot of kind of odd idiosyncrasies. Mm-hmm. Like, they might have some weird personal traits, and even things like decision fatigue is a big trait among, big CEOs. So they always dress the same way or eat the same meals or do the same thing at the same time every day because their lives are very routine, because it helps them to focus on making money and the other important things.
Right.
What do you think are some of the other kind of odd or unique traits that can be applied to someone who's super wealthy, or even not even odd traits, just like what qualities make someone kind of qualify for that type of high class?
Right. I mean, I think overwhelmingly, I would guesstimate that they started with what we would consider pretty wealthy to begin with. Like, I mean, there's certainly outliers to that, like Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos. But I think if you took like the group of people we would consider the super wealthy, I feel like a majority of them would have started off their lives being entrusted with more money than the average person would ever see. But I think maybe like a bit of, I don't want to say materialistic, but like practical ambition, where, you can want enough money to be comfortable and not need to be super wealthy. I think there's a huge gap there. And so to get yourself to that level, I think requires some level of ambition towards that sort of lifestyle.
Are there any of these people that feel like they have enough money? Like,
Well, I
do you think there's
that's
anyone that gets to
yeah.
that level and they're like, I'm good, or do they just keep trying to accumulate more and more wealth?
Well, I think that's the problem with it, is I think that kind of ambition is born of the idea that more will give you something of value. Like, money is just paper that stores value. That's all it is. So at a certain point, you have to question, like, okay, how much value am I getting out of more? And now, like, why am I doing it? And I do think some of them, I have to assume that some of them get to a point where it's like this same rat race that we're all in, just with more zeros after it, right? Like,
Yeah.
Fancy new things and more money gets old really fast when you get used to it. And, I think that's why you see like hyper wealthy people that have billions of dollars and still seem to need more and want more and try to figure out how to get more, because I feel like at that point, it's less about what it can buy and more about just stacking it up for, I don't know, ego's sake. I don't really know.
So I guess on the opposite end of that spectrum, and I don't think we need to necessarily talk about, characteristics of the lower class, but maybe we can have some fun by poking fun at ourselves at our lowest. What would you say is an example of the cheapest thing that you've ever done? A time that you wouldn't spend any money for some reason or tried to avoid spending money?
Oh, God. I think that's my problem, is like I'm always willing to spend it.
We've mentioned on the podcast before that we lived together for a little over a year. And when I was trying to answer this myself, I thought about the fact that we basically furnished our apartment with like dollar store plates and silverware, and even some appliances came from the dollar store. Like we had a knife set that was the dullest, most dangerous thing in the world because it came from the dollar store. And I think I had an iron that almost caught on fire one time.
Yeah, but the stuff worked for the most part. And I feel like that was the time, right? Like, we weren't trying to have a fancy place. It was really just a place for us to sleep and then get drunk on the weekend. Right? I mean, you were already with Rita, so you didn't have to impress anybody.
Yeah, I mean, that we weren't married. I feel like you still got to make an effort at that point.
That's fair.
Although, when we got our house, this just came across my Facebook not that long ago, because we got our silverware from my parents at her bridal shower before our wedding. And at some point she was like, we need to get rid of this dollar store furniture that is now in our house and use real silverware. And I think I posted a picture on Facebook like, my wife-to-be has told me that I've outgrown my dollar store silverware.
I'm just going to make a solid argument that if dollar store silverware was lasting several years, I feel like that's okay. It's
right?
It's
That's
clearly
a
well
win.
made. I feel like that's a billionaire's attitude. Why buy new forks when the forks we have work just fine?
All the millennial men that listen to this podcast right now are like, yeah, totally, guys. This is it. I can go furnish my apartment with dollar store crap. And all the women that listen to our podcast are rolling their eyes saying, no, you cannot do this. What is wrong with men?
Yeah. Well, there's a TikTok going around that's like how to have a cute apartment while living with a man. And it's basically like, don't let him buy anything. Don't let him look at anything before you put it there. Don't let him make any decisions. Just like do it all without him knowing and then present it to him.
With his credit card.
Yeah.
That's what Rita would say. Well, I was going to get into our B-Sider's early life in the first half of this episode, but I feel like we've done a fair bit of talking about our investment strategies.
What have we done?
Our apartment life. I feel like over 56 weeks of podcasting, we've really come into our own with being conversational and also sharing good history stories. So I think what
and
we'll
our
do
episode length is a correlative display of that.
I think what we'll do is take a quick break right here, and then we'll get into today's B-Sider, a woman named Hetty Green.
We'll be right back. It's everyone's favorite part of a podcast episode, the ad break,
I'm sure everyone is tired of listening to us talk by now.
which is presumably exactly why you've subscribed to our podcast, to hear us talk.
But seriously, we just wanted to take a minute to tell you some ways you can support the podcast on our website, historiesbside.com.
The first and most direct way you can support our podcast is by signing up for a membership. You can join at any monthly contribution level, but we suggest $10 to start. Though, please feel free to pick whatever fits into your budget. A membership will get you access to monthly boneless episodes, show notes, future episode cues, surprise gifts, and more.
We also have on there our merch shop, which includes things like t-shirts, hoodies, hats, drinkware, bags, stuff for adults, kids, and dogs, so you can rep your favorite history podcast everywhere you go.
You'll also find extras, including free stickers, bookmarks, and postcards. You can suggest an episode topic, or submit a question about the podcast, one of our episodes, or even about us.
That website again is historiesbside.com. And now, back to the episode. All right, welcome back. Definitely didn't expect the long conversations we have in that first half. I figured we should probably get into some actual history here.
Probably.
People come to this podcast to listen to us talk about anything.
I mean, if they're still listening, I assume that's true.
It's probably more for the history. We're getting to a point where we have some listeners that aren't just like our friends and family, and they probably actually do want to hear the content of the episode. So the woman we're here to talk about today is named Hetty Green, and it's someone I truly had never heard of until I came across this topic and literally just looking for interesting people to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll get into why she, I think, fits the B-sider category, but she came up, like I said, during the Gilded Age when you had a lot of these industrialists and wealthy financiers, and typically it's a very male-dominated field, so it's kind of interesting just to have a woman in the first place. But we'll get into kind of her family life and her upbringing first to kind of explain how she got into this super wealthy class. And then we'll talk about kind of what makes her unique and interesting and how she maintained and developed that wealth.
Mm-hmm.
So this episode is going to be a little back and forth. It's not necessarily going to be fully chronological of her life, but I thought it was kind of a unique topic for us because we're not talking about a ton of cultural things necessarily, or I don't know, the societal pressures of other things that happen in the world. It's neither like happy nor sad necessarily, but I thought she was really interesting and kind of a unique take on a part of history that we don't necessarily consider as much. So anyway, we'll get into her story. She was born Henrietta Howland Robinson on November 21st, 1834 in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Her parents were Edward Mott Robinson and Abby Howland Robinson, and her mother's family, the Howlands, owned one of the most successful whaling fleets and were involved in the shipping trade, and they were very wealthy as a result.
Was whaling still a big business at this time? I guess I don't have a good concept of when electricity kind of took the place of oil as a lighting fixture.
We talked about that a little bit in the Hiram Maxim episode a couple months ago. Mm-hmm. So that was a little bit later, 19th century. So by the time that she was born, her family would have been fairly established already, at least her mother's family.
Birth, yeah.
Yeah. So they had already made their money in the whaling industry, and I think it was still a big part of the economy or big industry at that point, especially in the New England area, New England states like Massachusetts.
Yeah.
So clearly, I mean, it had to have been if they were this successful and this wealthy. When she was very young, she lived with her grandfather, Gideon Howland, who taught her about financial matters and had her read stock quotes and commerce reports to him. When her grandfather died, her father took over the whaling business and continued to teach Heddie about business and finance, and she learned how to read ledgers and trade commodities. Heddie moved around a lot during her upbringing. She attended a boarding school in Sandwich at age 10. That would be Sandwich, Massachusetts.
Now I'm hungry.
Real town. She also attended summer lessons at the Friends Academy at age 15 and a finishing school in her late teens. She often lived with various family members, but always returned to work with the family business. She became the family bookkeeper at age 13 and continued to accompany her father as he ran the family business. As a result, she was very close with him, which was also due to the fact that her mother was often in poor health. One funny anecdote about her relationship with her father describes a gift that he gave her of, quote, a wardrobe full of the finest dresses of the season in order to attract a wealthy suitor. Hedy, however, didn't care so much about the wealthy suitor and sold all of the dresses and used the money to buy government bonds.
Can you explain a little bit about what a government bond is for listeners who might not know?
So have you ever had one? Did your parents ever buy them for you?
I don't know that I've ever owned. I mean, I was never given a government bond. I own a couple as part of my like stock portfolio or whatever, but no.
I have a couple that either my parents or some relatives bought us, my sisters and me, when we were young.
Mm-hmm.
And they're essentially what a government bond is. And I'm probably going to explain a lot of financial things poorly in this episode. But a government bond is kind of like a loan, not even a loan, that's a bad way to describe it. But it's a way for government to finance their own initiatives very quickly by having ordinary people pay for them.
Yeah.
And people will pay for these bonds, a little piece of paper that says basically the value that was paid for it. And it's worth almost nothing initially, but it generally will continue to mature and gain interest until it reaches its actual value, and then a little bit beyond that. So the longer you hold on to them, the more they're worth, until they eventually will reach a maximum value that they could be worth. So something that was given to me almost 30 years ago when I was a child wasn't worth much at the time that it was given to me. But now if I needed money to, I don't know, I think my sisters might have used some to pay for their college, or if I might have even cashed them in when we bought our house. Like if you need money, you can cash them in because you have them and it's money that technically the government owes you. It just takes time for them to really mature and be worth something actually more than just a little scrap of paper. Anyway, they're generally viewed as very safe investments because you're basically investing in the government versus something a little more volatile like a stock, or not that cryptocurrency was a thing at the time, but definitely something that's more volatile than a government bond would be. When Hedy's mother died in 1860, she left her $100,000 estate to her husband, except for an $8,000 house, which she gave to Hedy. And I tried to include a lot of these inflation calculations because we're talking about the 1860s and late 1800s in this episode, and that money is very different than what it's worth today. So I'm probably going to give double values on almost everything in this episode. So that $8,000 house that was left to Hedy was valued at about a $250,000 house today.
Right.
This would be the first of several large inheritances that Hedy would receive over the next decade or so. But later that year, her father sold off the whaling fleet and instead invested in William Tell Coleman's shipping firm and in government bonds. And these government bonds, like we just talked about, would actually pay about 6% interest in gold. And Hedy's father would become very wealthy from this business transaction. Also in 1860, her maternal aunt Sylvia Howland gifted her $20,000 in stocks, which would be the equivalent of $625,000 today. Pretty nice gift.
Yeah. I wouldn't mind it.
If anyone wants to invest in history's B-side, we will sell you, or you can give us $625,000 in stocks and we'll make a great podcast out of that. Hedy's father died in 1865. When he died, he left her about $6 million, which was the equivalent of $110 million.
That's it?
Yeah, and most of that was in a trust fund, which she couldn't really do anything with, but she did receive a regular income from it. However, he did also gift her about $919,000 in cash, which would be the equivalent of just under $17 million today. Her aunt Sylvia died shortly after her father and split her own $2 million estate between Charities in New Bedford and Heddie. So this $1 million was also placed into a trust. And that really wasn't enough for Heddie. She sued and claimed that Sylvia had updated her will to actually leave her entire estate to her, not just half. And the court proceedings around this took about 5 years, but ultimately it was ruled that the new will that Heddie claimed was forged. So she lost the suit, but was still awarded a settlement of $600,000.
So in addition to the $1 million she already got, she got $600,000.
That's how I interpreted it. I'm not sure if I'm 100% right on that, but I believe that as part of the lawsuit over the other half of her aunt's estate, she was awarded a $6,000 settlement. $600,000 settlement.
Remember earlier when you said, what are the characteristics of the super wealthy?
Mm-hmm.
Greed. I didn't say greed. One of them has to be greed, which I feel like is just a ruder way of saying what I said, which is that they're ambitious for money. But like, she was given $1 million and sued for the other $1 million. Like, I don't know.
She wanted what she thought was hers, entitled to her.
It's a lot of effort to sue somebody. It took 5 years of her life.
Especially when that other half was going to charity.
Oof.
So assuming my calculations here are correct, within the 1860s, Heddie was gifted or inherited around $7,628,000, or a little over $169 million in today's money.
Okay, this is exactly my point. She has $7.6 million, and she sued for $1. I don't know what you make, but I feel like the average like American that makes about $60,000 or $70,000 wouldn't spend 5 years suing somebody for $10,000.
I mean, that does sound a little like superfluous, but when you put it in terms of like proportion, $1 million would be, I don't know, 12% of what she had. Am I doing that math right? Like somewhere around that amount. So that's a pretty good chunk of change. Like I don't know what you make in a year, but if someone took 12% of everything that you owned, or was not allowing you to have 12% of everything that you owned because you thought you were entitled to that, you'd probably fight for it too.
Not for 5 years. I will say that. Like I would not. I don't know. I'm also living from a perspective where I can't really afford a lawyer, so I wouldn't sue anybody for anything at the moment.
Not that I'm like up here trying to defend the hyper wealthy, but
right.
Just playing devil's advocate, I guess. Some articles I read stated that her total inheritance was actually closer to $10 million, which would have been more than $221 million in today's money. So she was pretty well off. To be fair, most of it was in trusts where she couldn't fully access the money, but a significant amount of it was liquid. Either way, she was set for life. This also didn't include the government bonds, which were actually Civil War bonds, which by 1875 were actually backed by gold, meaning that they really did have true value. And as I mentioned, they would increase steadily at about 6% over the following years.
So is a Civil War bond different in some way from regular government bonds, or was it just a government bond that happened to be sold during the Civil War?
That's what it was. It was a government bond that was sold to fund the Civil War.
Okay.
I think, I don't know all the historical background on Civil War bonds, but I do think that they had a little bit more value than certain other government bonds of the time period, because Congress would eventually pass a bill to back them by gold, which made them have that more intrinsic value than just here's money that you gave to the government.
Right. Well, because I feel like war bonds, or when the government needs money during war, it's a little bit more urgent, so they need to encourage people to do it. Right.
Yeah. And obviously the Civil War was a pretty big moment in American history. So all this is really to say that Hetty Howland Robinson, or would later be known as Hedy Green, was pretty set up in her life to be successful and be in a pretty good point to not have to want for much in her life. Several years before all this, while she was living in New York with her father, Hetty met Edward Henry Green. And Green was in the trade business in Boston and in the Far East, which at this time would have been China. He was a partner with the Russell Sturgis and Company, and himself a millionaire. Edward Green and Hetty Robinson would marry on July 11th, 1867. Prior to his death, Hetty's father had stipulated in his will that her inheritance should be free from the debts, control, or interference of any such husband. This meant that Edward Green was forced to sign an early version of what we would call a prenup, which renounced all his rights to Hetty's money before their wedding. Following their wedding, the couple moved to Manhattan. But when Hetty's cousins attempted to have her indicted for forgery over the suit of her aunt's estate, the Greens moved to London.
So I didn't really even think of this when we first talked about it, but do you think she actually did try to forge the other will?
Probably. The fact that she lost that lawsuit makes me think that someone forged it, and I don't know who else would have incentive to forge it besides the woman suing to get 100% of the estate.
So she forged the document and still got half of what she was owed out of the settlement.
Yeah, I don't know all the details around that lawsuit.
Dang.
Just that what I read was that the will stated that she would receive half of the estate and the other half would go to these charities. She sued because she claimed that she had a new version of the will that said that she should get the entire estate, and the judge basically ruled that her new version of the will was forged. So I don't know why she still got a settlement out of that, but
yeah.
Either way, she got some money. She good. Edward and Hedy Green had 2 children named Edward Howland Robinson Green, or Ned as they called him, and Harriet Sylvia Ann Howland Green, or Sylvia as they called her. And I think it's really interesting. There's lots of family names in their kids' names. I mean, they kept Howland in both names, so obviously her maternal family was very prominent. But also their son shared the name of both her husband and her father. Their daughter shared her own name and also her aunt's name. So you can see who the important people in her life were.
Can you imagine? Harriet Sylvia Ann Howland Green.
It's all the important people.
5 names.
Those were the times.
Those were the times.
The family would eventually return to the United States in the 1870s and settle in Vermont. Edward Green was less cautious with his investment strategies than his wife. Hetty often had to bail him out of debt until one instance in 1885 where he attempted to use $550,000 of her money to cover a loss without her consent. Thanks to her existing prenup agreement, the bank refused to give him the money. And this incident caused the couple to separate. Though they never fully divorced, their marriage was estranged for much of their remaining lives. So let's talk a little bit about Hetty's investment strategy and some of her philosophies around finances, which is really kind of what helped cement her as a successful financier and very, very, very wealthy woman. Hetty's success was driven through her investment strategy, something you actually mentioned earlier in the episode: buy low and sell high. She's quoted as saying, "I buy when things are low and nobody wants them. I keep them until they go up and people are crazy to get them. That is, I believe, the secret of all successful business." Today we call this value investing, which means buying stocks that appear to be trading for less than their intrinsic or their book value. And at the time, this was viewed as a contrarian investment strategy, which means opposite of the norm. Most people weren't buying stocks that were valued very low because it just seemed like a bad idea. Those stocks weren't performing well. Today, this is probably one of the most well-known investment strategies that you could take.
Yeah.
Any novice tries to do this and hopes that it works out.
Mm.
Hetty also liked to thoroughly learn and consider every aspect of a business investment before making any decision on it. She said, "In business generally, don't close a bargain until you have reflected on it overnight." She grew her fortunes through investments in government or Civil War bonds, railroad stocks, and real estate. And while she did trade stocks, she preferred to invest in real estate, particularly in Chicago. She also liked to maintain a considerable amount of liquid funds, which is essentially cash, for lending purposes. When the Panic of 1907 took place, she helped bail out many Wall Street investors when many banks were unable to do so. And I hadn't really heard of the Panic of 1907. I think we're all familiar with the Great Depression, but
Right.
there's actually been quite a few of these financial meltdowns and panics in American history. But this one in particular was a short banking and financial crisis caused by excessive speculative investment and loose federal monetary policy.
Can you briefly explain both of these things and why they might cause a financial crisis?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm probably going to misexplain a lot of these financial things in this episode, but doing the best that I can to make it simple. This particular event was caused when a lot of banks were sort of investing in particular stocks, trying to corner the market on certain stocks. But when the stocks didn't perform in the way that they expected them to, I think the one in particular in this incident was a copper fund or a copper company. The stocks, when they didn't perform the way they expected them to, the banks lost a ton of money, which made people start to panic because they had their money in these banks and they didn't have money. The banks weren't liquid. So people tried to pull their money out of the banks, which made a lot of banks go under. And that's really kind of what hurt a lot of these investors, because suddenly, I mean, we've kind of touched on it, like money isn't a real thing necessarily. It's just something that we kind of believe is real and has value. But if you can't really pay that out, then you've essentially lost it. So that was a big part of it. Another aspect to it was that there were these things called bucketeering. Is that the term I'm not sure if that's the right term, but basically it was like a side bets that people would make. They could bet on what stocks would do in the market, which is a highly illegal activity now, but at the time it wasn't illegal. And it was rife for corruption. People could mess with the stock market just to try to win these side bets and make money that way.
Yeah.
And then the third thing was that there just wasn't a lot of government, federal financial oversight on this. There was no thing like the Federal Reserve that acted as a financier for investors, like a last resort financier for investors. There was no one to really regulate kind of how stocks were traded. A lot of the things that we view as illegal or unsavory practices today, people get away with them. So it really opened up the financial sector to be really kind of sketchy and put them at risk of a lot of these crises like this. So this particular event actually would lead to the creation of the Federal Reserve System several years later, which kind of showed that the government needed to have this sort of oversight into what was happening with people's money. But because there was no system like the Fed at the time, it led a lot of investors to rely on wealthy financiers like J.P. Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and even Hetty Green to kind of bail them out. These people lost all their money, so they had to borrow from people that had a ton of liquid assets, like these wealthy people, to give them money, and then they would pay their money back to them with heavy interest fees and returns. And I thought that was an important point to make because in her time, Green's wealth and her business knowledge and acumen really did put her on par with the likes of people like J.P. Morgan and John Rockefeller. She's likely not as well known as them because her money was from investments and not industrialism in the way that they grew their wealth. And, she's a woman.
Yeah.
Definitely a male-dominated field at the time. And on that note, Hedy Green strongly believed in the financial independence of women and girls. I included a couple quotes from her talking about this where she said, "It is the duty of every woman, I believe, to learn and take care of her own business affairs. A girl should be brought up as to be able to make her own living, and whether rich or poor, a young woman should know how a bank account works, understand the composition of mortgages and bonds, and know the value of interest and how it accumulates." And I think we kind of, in today's society, view these as like, of course, everyone should know this stuff. Like, it's not that novel that a girl should be able to make her own living or should kind of understand how money works.
Right.
But that's from our lens, that this time period, this was very novel that women should be involved in finances when it typically was just she had her husband or the man of the house would handle these matters for her. What makes Hedy Green unique and notable, and really what made her story pop out to me that I wanted to do an episode about her, is her legendary and well-known frugality. So we introduced her in this episode as the Witch of Wall Street, which was her most common nickname. And this nickname could stem from a few places. It could be her Quaker upbringing. It could be her extraordinary instinct regarding investment and business acumen. Could be the fact that she had a very drab attire of long black dresses, or the fact that she had a very short temper and, it's noted, less than spectacular personal hygiene.
Do you think, you mentioned misogyny on Wall Street, do you think that had a role to play in her being labeled a witch?
Maybe, but you're giving away the ending a bit here.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely going to play into it too, but also a little bit just in the way that she kind of carried herself. We'll talk about that a little bit, that maybe in some ways she did kind of resemble a literal witch. But of course, there's probably some of that tied into it as well.
Right.
So a lot of this, it seems, were actually the effects of Hedy Green's legendary thriftiness. Following her husband's early death in 1902, she adorned dark mourning clothes almost daily. She also became even more obsessed with making and maintaining her money. Her unwillingness to spend her money on even the smallest of luxuries were well documented in newspapers of the day. So to give a few examples, she wore only the one black dress until it was worn out and instructed her laundress to wash only the dirtiest parts in order to save on soap. She never turned on the heat or used hot water. She rarely washed her hands, and it's noted that her fingernails were crusty and dirty.
Ew.
Hedy Green, meet Ignace Semmelweis. She also didn't have an office to conduct her business because she didn't want to pay the rent on it. So instead, she conducted most of her business sprawled out on the floor of the Seaboard National Bank in New York, using trunks and suitcases full of her paperwork as her desk.
Oh my gosh.
Her daily lunch consisted of dry oatmeal warmed on a register in someone else's office. And it's noted that due to her hygiene, many employees at the bank made it a point to keep their distance from her. Even her children were dressed in ragged, worn-out clothes. In the wintertime, she lined their clothes and shoes with paper to keep them warm.
I mean, I'm all for trying to be frugal, but I gotta say, like, this seems pretty ludicrous. Like, she's got millions and millions of dollars, and her children are wearing paper to stay warm. Like, I feel like if you're living like you live in poverty in order to have wealth, you're kind of missing the whole point.
Yeah. It is weird because I understand, wealthy people don't like to part with their money necessarily, but you think you'd enjoy at least the basic luxuries.
Right. Well, that's the thing. Like we talked about twice now, money itself intrinsically doesn't have any value. It's what it can afford you. It's the value it has as a tradable item. And so if you're not trading it, I struggle to understand why it has any value at all, especially if you're not trading it for basic life comforts. Like, why have millions of dollars if you're going to struggle like you are completely broke? Because that kind of sounds like what she's doing.
So this morning, Rita asked me what my topic was going to be when we recorded later today, and I was like, oh, it's this super wealthy woman who was known as like the wealthiest woman in America in her time. But what makes her interesting is that she was extremely cheap and like never wanted to spend any of her money ever on even basic things. And Rita was like, well, did she grow up poor? And I was like, well, I mean, that would explain a lot because there are people that know what it's like to live like that. And that's probably would explain that type of behavior. But Hedy Green didn't grow up poor. Like her family was wealthy. She's always had money. And like her money came from her family. She inherited much of it and then she invested it well enough to be successful on her own. But I don't know, she never had to live like this. So it's weird that she had this kind of behavior patterns.
Yeah. It's almost like she was like singularly focused on amassing as much money as possible just for the sake of
just not
it.
spending it. Yeah. One of the most egregious examples of her frugality involved her son, Ned. He broke his leg in a sledding accident when he was 9 years old, and rather than taking him to get the care he needed, Green dressed herself and her son as if they were homeless so they could attempt to get care at a free clinic.
Oh my Lord.
After she was discovered, they were refused care and she attempted to fix his injury herself. Ned grew up lame until his teen years when his leg became gangrenous and had to be amputated above the knee.
Oh my God. Okay. I'm sorry for laughing at that, but like, come on. You're like, now you're not just like, what?
Yeah.
She let her child grow
sick.
up lame and have his leg amputated above the knee in his teens to save money. I'm sorry. The woman has an unhealthy relationship with money. She does.
It wasn't just her son either. I mean, Hedy herself endured a painful hernia for 20 years of her life before she finally sought surgery on it. One anecdote I read said that she used to poke at the swelling with a stick to try to make it go down until it just got to the point where she couldn't handle it anymore. And she finally got surgery.
She poked it with a stick. Oh my God. Can you imagine if somebody was like, oh no, I just poke it with a stick until it goes away?
I think there's a Simpsons bit about that on some episode.
Oh my God.
But anyway, when she got the care for it, she got the bill, which was a staggering $150. Can you imagine medical care for $150? And it was so
like
egregious that she she tried to avoid actually paying for it, which apparently was a common trait of hers with almost any time she got services from someone else, that she tried to find ways to get out of paying for them.
She kind of seems like she sucks.
Well, yeah.
She's like
maybe
the person that eats most of the steak and then complains that it was underdone and wants a new steak.
She wasn't eating steak. She was eating dry oatmeal and
dry oatmeal heated. Couldn't even heat it yourself. You had to use a coworker's
someone else's heater because she
radiator.
didn't use hers. Like all people of great wealth, Hedy also knew how to avoid paying taxes.
Of course.
She moved frequently between small, low-rent, unfurnished apartments in New Jersey, which protected her from New York tax collectors. One article I read said that her rent was never more than $22 a month, which was about $662, which I think is about what our rent was in Boardman, Ohio. Several years
but that's
ago.
one of the lowest rents.
Right,
in
one of
the
the lowest
country.
cost of living areas in the country in 20.
Oh man, I missed that. I would die for that right now. Living like a king. Jeez.
Hedy also expected the same careful financial practices of her children. Ned would eventually receive a law degree and was taught to manage his mother's assets after she passed. Sylvia was the only person Hedy ever splurged on, although not very often. Hedy wanted to find a proper suitor for her daughter, someone who would not simply be marrying for her money. She found Matthew Astor Wilkes, who himself was worth about $2 million. But Hedy still required him to sign a prenup before marrying her daughter. Both of her children were a little more open to enjoying the luxuries of their wealth later in life after their mother had passed away. Ned left almost all of his estate to Sylvia when he died, and Sylvia left almost all of her wealth to schools, hospitals, and charities when she would eventually die. So they were maybe a little bit more charitable than she was, but, it was kind of her money that would eventually get passed on.
Right.
And Hedy herself actually did give quite a bit to charity in her lifetime, though she did so while avoiding the attention of the press. She claimed that she believed in discreet charity.
I can buy that.
Hedy would continue to work every day until her mid-70s. She reportedly contracted pneumonia and was, quote, near death at age 77. But she survived, although was noticeably weaker. She then moved to her son's home in New York City, where she then lived out her remaining years. She died of apoplexy on July 3rd, 1916, quote, after arguing with a maid over the virtues of skimmed milk.
What is apoplexy?
So it's an old medical term for like when an internal organ should burst. Generally, we would call that a stroke today. But the reason apoplexy is not used as a medical term anymore is because now we're able to identify what organ ruptured or whatever caused the problem. So it's not necessarily a stroke, although it probably was for Hedy Green, because some later New York Times reports actually claim that she had suffered a series of strokes leading up to her death. At the time that she died, Hedy Green's net worth is estimated close to $200 million in 1916 dollars, which would be the equivalent of over $5 billion today. In contrast, J.P. Morgan, who died only 3 years before her, was estimated to be worth around $80 million at his death. So she was worth, 150% of J.P. Morgan?
Yeah, that's wild.
It is interesting that that's a name that we know as a wealthy financier, but most people haven't heard of Hedy Green. And we started this episode, as I said, and brought it up later, calling her the Witch of Wall Street, which, although was her most common nickname, really likely draws from misogyny of her time, being that she was a woman who was incredibly successful in finance, which at the time was strictly a man's field. There were quite a few other nicknames that were given to her. I chose the Witch of Wall Street for this episode title just because it was her most common name, but she was known by the Queen of Wall Street. A lot of people actually took financial advice from her, and that's kind of why she was called that particular name. Some other ones attributed to her would be like the Wizard of Finance, the grandmother of value investing, which is that buy low, sell high strategy, because she's one of the first people that really took that strategy and made it successful and showed how you can do it well. She was known as the richest woman in America, or possibly the world at the time. And today she holds the Guinness Book of World Records for the world's greatest miser.
It's definitely an interesting story. It's like so surprising to me that she was willing to live like she lived.
Yeah,
to do this.
It's weird, for sure. I don't know if you want to have the conversation about whether or not she was a good person or a bad person, because I don't think we have really a ton of anecdotes that say either way. Like, I don't think we could really say she was a bad person unless you just are one of those people that think that all super wealthy people are inherently bad. Maybe she wasn't the greatest mother and put, saving a few dollars over her son's well-being. But I don't know. I just, in general, I don't think that she necessarily did anything that was necessarily conniving to get her money, short of maybe forging her aunt's will.
And avoiding taxes.
Oh, it was legal, right?
They all do that.
But I mean, she did reportedly give to charity as well, too. So I don't know how much necessarily, but I don't know. Yeah. I guess it's kind of that conversation where if you are of that super wealthy class, you're kind of well within your rights to do with it as you please, I guess.
Right.
And she obviously had to have been very smart to be this wealthy financier and be successful in business. So I think she deserves the credit for that, too.
I agree. Do you feel like you're ready for a financial quiz?
After the conversations in the first half of this episode, probably not.
None of them are about crypto.
That's good. Crypto wasn't a thing during her lifetime, so I'd be kind of mad if you did include questions about crypto.
All of them are crypto questions. There's just 3.
Which one is the best one to invest in right now?
That is one of the questions.
I'm going to get that one wrong.
As financial advice officially given by History's B-Side host, Philip Hall.
No, it is not. Don't sue me.
We'll be right back. All right, welcome back. So, as many of our listeners know, we like to end every episode with a short quiz for our host to see what he has learned in his research and also to give our listeners a chance to test their own knowledge. I feel like this quiz had many possibilities given the wide subject material today. I tried to keep it pretty on point, but I can't promise that all the questions are about Heddie.
Love that for me.
I'll leave her question for last. The first one is pretty straightforward, but it's, I don't know, kind of trivial as trivia questions can be.
Is that where the name comes from?
I don't know. It's like a chicken or the egg situation. So we talked a lot about the stock market and our investment strategies and Heddie's investment strategies. And no doubt one of the groups she worked the most with would have been the New York Stock Exchange. What year was the New York Stock Exchange founded?
Oh, I have no idea. That's very specific.
It is very specific. But I felt like it was history oriented and people should know how long the New York Stock Exchange has been around.
Jeez. anything I guess is just going to be a random shot in the dark. So let's say like 1840.
It is almost as old. I will not accept that answer. It is almost as old as the United States of America.
Really?
So I'll give you that.
1780.
The New York Stock Exchange was founded on May 17th, 1792.
Well, I was not going to get that one.
On Wall Street in New York. Surprise there. I assumed it was that far back only because there were like Dutch and English trading companies around at the time. So I would have assumed that shortly after founding the nation, they would have established a New York Stock Exchange. I'm kind of curious if Hamilton had a lot to do with that, given his place in, the beginning of our country's financial operation.
I definitely don't know enough about the history of the stock market. So that seems weird to me that would be one of the first major industries that would be established kind of after the United States got going, but maybe it shouldn't be that surprising to me.
Yeah. I think the oldest thing I've learned about is the Dutch tulip bubble, which was around this time. I think it was slightly before this time, but the Dutch trading companies and traders were so into these tulip bulbs, literally the flower, because they had all of these heirloom varieties that were special colors, and people went bananas over these, and it turned into a bubble where people were paying a lot of money for tulip bulbs. And then eventually it popped because they're just flower seeds. And
there are tons of agricultural things like that had people could invest in and had bubbles that burst like that. I don't know the whole story off the top of my head, but it's worth looking into if it's interesting to anyone. But I think onions were this huge major bubble at one point, that there's something to do with onions that you can't buy stock on them anymore. They're so heavily regulated because it caused massive problems or something.
Yeah.
But definitely kind of an odd thing to think about.
Those onions.
They'll make you cry.
Maybe if you invest in the wrong time. So for your second question, one of the things we talked about Hedy being was frugal in sometimes really extreme ways. But when most people think about being frugal, they think about spending less money every day. And one of the most commonly thrown around examples of this is skipping your morning cup of coffee. And this can be a really beneficial way to save money. And a lot of people don't realize how much they spend every day or every month on a cup of coffee. So my question for you is, on average, how much does an American spend on coffee per month or per year? You can give it to me either way.
I think I just heard on a podcast somewhere that the average cup of coffee in America costs $2.50. That might be wrong, but I'm going to use it as my benchmark here and say that, if you want to multiply it by 30, would it be $75 a month? That seems crazy. That seems way too high. But there's people that buy expensive coffee, so I'm going to go with it. $75 a month.
You are too low.
Really?
The average American spends about $1,100 per year on coffee, averaging out to $92 per month.
Wow.
So consider
coffee at home, people.
Well, totally. That's why I do it. But when I do buy coffee out, which is way more than I should, it's rarely cheaper than $3. I don't remember the last time I got a cup, and I just get plain drip black coffee, like a medium 16 or 12 ounce black coffee. It's nothing fancy anymore, unless I'm in the mood to treat myself for some reason. But it's usually $2.50 to $3.50 before the tip. So
jeez,
I fully buy that this happens. I don't do it every day, and so mine is. And interestingly enough, I was surprised. Like mine is probably lower than that. I mean, like it might hit that because I sometimes buy for Allie and I, but that's the second person now that we have to consider as far as the calculation. $92 is a lot of money.
I know we are running long by just talking on this episode, but we've talked that you and I used to spend a lot of time hanging out at coffee shops, like in college and stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you would remember this, but I never drank coffee then. I only ever drank tea. And I didn't drink coffee through pretty much all of college because I didn't want to drink it because I knew if I did, I would spend a ton of money on it.
Mm-hmm.
So I worked at Panera for 4.5 years and never drank coffee when I could get it for free. And then as soon as I left Panera, I started drinking coffee. I don't know why. And I realized I was going to Dunkin' Donuts like almost every day. So I finally bought a coffee. When we lived together, I didn't buy a coffee maker until you moved out, and I didn't have a coffee maker, and I started buying coffee, and I was like, ugh. So I went and bought a coffee maker just so I would stop spending money going out. And I mean, that's, I guess, an example of me being frugal, but I think that's just a smart thing to do. Make coffee at home, people. It's better at home than it is anywhere else anyway.
I mean, my frugality is still probably expensive, because like my frugality is locally made bags, like tea bags of ground coffee, and this is 10 packages for $18. So we're talking $1.80 per cup of homemade coffee. It's not that much cheaper, but I make myself do it.
Honey, baby Matt, you're bougie.
We can hopefully get a sponsorship. I don't know. Caravan Coffee in Newburgh, people. Call them. Tell them about us. But yeah, I mean, my cheap coffee, it depends on how lazy I want to be. But even if I make it, even if I grind beans, it's still you're right, I am bougie. I still buy like a $14 to $17 bag of coffee beans from some coffee roaster. And I mean, that you get a lot more out of. Like, I would say I get at least 20 cups out of that. So it's cheaper than like using tea bags, but it's still not like Keurig Maxwell House cheap.
I buy like $5 bags of ground coffee from Aldi.
You plebeian.
It's fair trade.
Do you even know what that means?
Yeah, we talked about it on like my last episode.
We did. For your final question.
Boy, this one's really gone off the rails.
And most pertinent question about Hedy Green. You mentioned that at age 13, she was already learning how to bookkeep. But at what age did Hedy Green open her first bank account with money she had saved from her allowance?
Oh, I read this. She was like 8 or 9, wasn't she?
She was 8 years old. Good job.
Hey. You got one right.
You did. It's the one about her, so I'll take it.
Yeah, that's fair. That's the one I should get right.
True. Well, this is clocked at one of our longer episodes. Hope you guys like money.
Nah, it won't be that bad once we cut it down. No. Definitely one of our chattier episodes, I feel like. I guess that's a product of, well, probably a couple things. It's 56 episodes that we've done now, so definitely getting comfortable, combined with how late it is that we're doing this, and your last episode as a regular co-host.
Sad.
I'm sad.
Sorry, buddy. Your history ventures will continue.
Well, anyway, thank you guys so much for listening to another episode of History's B-Side. We really appreciate you. I know I've certainly appreciated having Matt put in all the work that we've done on these 56 episodes so far. We will have more History's B-Side in the future. If you'd like more from the show, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at History's B-Side, or you can find out more about us, the show, or support the podcast at historiesbside.com. Thank you guys so much for listening. Matt, any final words?
I'll see you next week. History's B-Side is an independent, listener-supported podcast.
Leave us a review or subscribe to the show on your favorite podcasting service. And follow along on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at History's B-Side.
Send us your feedback or inquire about sponsorship and advertising opportunities by emailing us at podcast@historiesbside.com.
You can support the show by becoming a member or making a one-time contribution at historiesbside.com. While you're there, check out our merch shop, extras, and more.
This episode was researched and produced by your hosts, Matt Melito
and Philip Hall. Thanks for listening to History's B-Side.